In a German forest stinking of rotting leaves and gunpowder, a squad of exhausted American soldiers was about to secure a strategic crossroads. A routine mission turned deadly when a hidden MG-42 opened fire, cutting down 7 men in seconds. Sergeant, Frank Delaney wasn't your typical infantry leader. For 3 years he was a battle-hardened veteran who'd survived North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy. Known for his uncanny ability to sense danger before it struck. When German SS troops ambushed his squad from an elevated hunting blind, they had no idea they were facing men who refused to die in some goddamn hole. Delaney organized a desperate counterattack that would trigger a bloody struggle for survival against impossible odds. What began as a simple objective would become a brutal test of courage and sacrifice. The forest crossroads would never be the same after 5 determined soldiers fought to complete their mission, regardless of the cost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The forest stank of rotting leaves and gunpowder. Sergeant Frank Delaney paused, raising a closed fist that halted the 11 men behind him. Something felt wrong, a prickling sensation at the base of his neck that had saved his life more times than he cared to count. "Hold," he murmured, voice barely audible above the distant artillery. Corporal Tony DeLuca crept forward, his Thompson submachine gun clutched tight against his chest. "What is it, Sarge?" Delaney had heard about this stretch of German forest, how it swallowed American squads whole. Intelligence claimed the Krauts were in retreat, but Delaney hadn't survived 3 years of this war by trusting intelligence reports. He studied the dense trees ahead, every sense straining. "We're being watched," he said finally. "Private Will." Grayson shifted nervously behind them, the new replacement who'd joined them just 3 days ago. The kid was still clean-shaven, uniform relatively unwrinkled. The others had taken to calling him lucky, not because he was, but because he hadn't been hit yet. A superstition that felt like tempting fate. "You sure, Sarge?" Grayson whispered, eyes darting between the trees. "Command said this route was clear." Delaney didn't answer. Instead, he caught the eye of PFC Johnny Mercer, their Kentucky sharpshooter, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Mercer felt it too. 300 yards to the crossroads, Delaney said, quietly, glancing at his map. "Once we secure it, reinforcements move in. Simple job, boys." Simple. Nothing in this war had been simple since North Africa. Sicily hadn't been simple. Normandy sure as hell hadn't been simple. And this, a supposedly routine mission to secure a crossroads in some nameless German forest, had every nerve in his body screaming. "Spread out," he ordered. 5-yard intervals. "Mercer, watch our right flank." DeLuca left. "Doc, stay central." Private Joe Carver, Doc to everyone in the squad, nodded grimly, his medic's bag hanging heavy at his side. The man hadn't slept in 36 hours, his eyes hollow as he checked the pistol at his hip, a Kansas farm boy who'd joined to save lives rather than take them. Now his hands were permanently stained rust brown despite his obsessive washing. "Lucky you stick close to Doc," Delaney added. Everyone moved slow and quiet. They advanced through the trees, boots crushing the carpet of pine needles. The forest was too quiet, the usual birdsong absent. Just the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional crack of small arms fire from miles away. Reminders that the dying continued, even as rumors circulated that the Germans were weeks from surrender. Delaney had heard those rumors before. Each time, more men died. The morning fog lingered between the trees, ghostly tendrils reaching like fingers across the forest floor. Visibility dropped to 30 yards in some places. Perfect ambush conditions. "Sarge," Mercer's Kentucky drawl came from Delaney's right, barely above a whisper. "Movement, 2 o'clock. Can't make it out." Delaney followed Mercer's gaze but saw nothing. He trusted the sharpshooter's eyes more than his own. "Everyone down," he whispered harshly. The men dropped to their knees, weapons up, scanning. Seconds ticked by. Nothing moved. "False alarm," DeLuca muttered, never one for patience. Delaney was about to respond when he heard it, the distinctive metallic click of an MG-42 being primed, a sound every infantryman knew, the harbinger of death. Cover! He shouted, diving sideways. The forest erupted. The German machine gun, nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw for its terrifying rate of fire, tore through the trees, the sound deafening in the confined space. Bark exploded from trunks, wood splinters and bullets flying in equal measure. Men screamed. Delaney hit the ground hard, scrambling behind a fallen tree as rounds stitched the earth where he'd stood moments before. The MG-42 fired almost 1,200 rounds per minute, 20 bullets per second. No time to think, only react. Move, move, move. He bellowed between bursts. To his left, Private Miller went down instantly, chest torn open. Gutierrez and Wilson were cut apart seconds later, their bodies jerking grotesquely as the bullets found them. Sergeant Peterson made it 3 steps before a burst caught him across the back, dropping him face first into the dirt. Jesus Christ. Someone sobbed, probably Grayson. Return fire, DeLuca was screaming, his Thompson spraying wildly toward the muzzle flash barely visible through the trees. Delaney spotted a shallow depression ahead, an old shell crater offering the only real cover in the killing zone they'd wandered into. The crater. Go. Mercer moved first, pulling a dazed Grayson with him as he darted forward. Doc Carver followed, half-carrying Private Jenkins, whose leg pumped bright arterial blood with each step. DeLuca provided covering fire, his face contorted with rage. Go, Corporal, Delaney ordered, firing his M1 in controlled bursts toward the German position. DeLuca hesitated, then sprinted for the crater. Delaney followed last, rounds kicking up dirt at his heels as he dove headfirst into the shallow pit. The crater stank, of wet earth and cordite. Pressed against its edge, Delaney did a quick count. 5. 5 men left out of 12. The rest lay scattered in the forest behind them, unmoving. Is everyone? He began, but Doc cut him off. Jenkins is gone, Sarge. Delaney looked over to where Doc knelt beside the private's body. The young man's eyes stared sightlessly upward, his chest no longer rising. The lower half of his fatigues was soaked crimson. I couldn't. Doc's voice cracked. There was much blood, his femoral artery. Delaney nodded once sharply. Nothing you could do. The words felt hollow, rehearsed. He'd said them too many times. The MG-42 continued firing in controlled bursts, keeping them pinned. Each time it fell silent, Delaney counted. 3 seconds. 5. Never more than 7 before it opened up again, forcing them back down. They've got us zeroed, Mercer said quietly, his rifle clutched against his chest, eyes calculating distances. Waiting for us to make a move. DeLuca slammed a fresh magazine into his Thompson. We can't just sit here. We won't, Delaney assured. Him, taking stock of their situation. The crater was about 15 feet across, 2 feet deep at its center, barely enough to keep them below the machine gun's line of fire. Beyond it, the forest continued for another 100 yards before opening onto the clearing that contained their objective. The crossroads. The German nest had to be positioned somewhere along that tree line, with perfect sight lines to cut down anyone approaching. Grayson was shaking, his rifle clutched in white-knuckled hands. What do we do now, Sarge? His voice sounded impossibly young. Delaney studied the private. 18, maybe 19 years old. Still believed in things like honor and glory. Still thought the medals meant something. Delaney had received a Silver Star after Sicily. He'd thrown it into the Mediterranean the same night. Now we assess, Private, he said calmly. Ammo check. Now. They counted quickly. Between them, they had 6 grenades, DeLuca's Thompson with 4 magazines, Mercer's M1903 Springfield with 24 rounds, Delaney's M1 Garand with 32 rounds, and Grayson's rifle with a half-empty clip. Doc carried only his .45 pistol with 2 magazines. Not enough for a prolonged fight, Mercer observed quietly. Then we make it short, DeLuca growled. I say we flank them. Mercer and I can circle around while you keep them distracted. Delaney shook his head. Ground's too open, they'd cut you down before you made 50 yards. The MG-42 roared again, sending them ducking deeper into the crater. A tree branch splintered overhead, raining bark and wood chips down on them. Doc was checking Jenkins's dog tags, his face impassive but his hands trembling slightly. Delaney watched him remove one tag and pocket it, leaving the duplicate around the dead man's neck. A ritual they'd all performed too many times. They know exactly where we are, Grayson said, panic edging into his voice. We're trapped. We're soldiers, Delaney corrected firmly, and soldiers find a way. But as another burst of machine gun fire tore through the air above them, even Delaney felt the cold fingers of doubt. 7 men had died in seconds. The rest were pinned in a hole barely deep enough to qualify as cover. No radio, no artillery support, just 5 men with limited ammunition against a fortified machine gun. Mercer, Delaney said, can you get eyes on their position? The sharpshooter nodded, then carefully raised his head just enough to peer over the crater's edge. The MG-42 immediately sent a burst in their direction, forcing him back down. Northeast corner of the clearing, Mercer reported. Elevated position maybe 15 feet up. Some kind of hunting blind or observation post. I saw sandbags, at least 2 helmets. Delaney processed this. How far? 150 yards, give or take, DeLuca snorted. Might as well be a mile, with that buzzsaw covering the approach. Grayson had his eyes squeezed shut, lips moving in what might have been a prayer. Doc stared fixedly at Jenkins's body, his expression unreadable. Delaney knew what command would expect. Hold position and wait for reinforcements. But reinforcements wouldn't come unless they secured that crossroads. A classic military catch-22. They couldn't advance because of the machine gun, and help wouldn't arrive until they neutralized the machine gun. Another burst from the MG-42 tore through the air, closer this time. They were walking the fire in, getting the range dialed in. Soon even the crater wouldn't provide protection. We can't go back, Delaney said finally. And we can't stay here. DeLuca nodded grimly. So we go forward. How? Grayson asked, voice cracking. They'll cut us down the second we move. Delaney looked at each man in turn. DeLuca, vibrating with contained rage. Mercer, calculating angles with the cool precision of a mathematician. Doc, whose compassion had calcified into something harder through endless exposure to suffering. And Grayson, young and terrified but still looking to him for answers. His men. His responsibility. We're going to take that nest, Delaney said, voice hardening with resolve. Or we're going to die trying. Because those are the only options we've got. The machine gun fell silent again. In the sudden quiet, they could hear distant shouting in German. Brief respite or the calm before the storm. Either way, Delaney knew the time for deliberation was over. The next decision he made would determine whether any of them lived to see tomorrow. We're going to take that nest, Delaney had said. But, in the minutes that followed, the weight of those words settled into the crater like another presence among them. The MG-42 erupted again, sending a spray of dirt cascading over their heads. Delaney pressed himself deeper into the earth, counting seconds between bursts. The German gunner was methodical, conserving ammunition while maintaining suppressive fire. 6 seconds, Delaney muttered. Getting longer between bursts. They might be running low, DeLuca snorted. Or they're just toying with us. Cats playing with mice. Delaney ignored him, turning to Mercer. How's your angle from here? The sharpshooter shook his head. Can't get a clean shot. Their positions, well fortified, sandbags on 3 sides. I'd need to be at least 30 yards that way, he pointed to their right, to have any chance. 30 yards might as well be 30 miles with that buzzsaw covering the ground, DeLuca said, his knuckles white around the Thompson's grip. Delaney studied the terrain beyond their crater. The forest floor sloped gently upward toward the crossroads, offering minimal cover. A few fallen logs, scattered boulders, none substantial enough to protect a man from machine gun fire. The German position dominated the landscape with brutal efficiency. Sarge, Doc Carver called softly from where he knelt beside Jenkins' body. Farley's still alive. Delaney turned. Behind them, partly concealed by the crater's edge, Private Farley lay crumpled and motionless. In the chaos, Delaney hadn't even seen him make it to the crater. The man's chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular movements, his uniform soaked with blood from multiple wounds. Jesus, Grayson whispered. I thought everyone else was dead. Doc moved to Farley's side, medical bag already open. Multiple trauma, chest and abdomen, he's losing blood fast. His hands moved with practiced precision despite the tremor in his fingers. Can you stabilize him? Delaney asked, already knowing the answer. Doc met his eyes. I can make him comfortable. The unspoken truth hung between them. Farley was dying, and nothing in Doc's bag could change that. Another burst from the machine gun tore through the air above them. Closer this time. They're adjusting their aim, Mercer observed quietly. Walking it in. They'll have the range dialed in soon, Delaney calculated rapidly. How long? 5 minutes, maybe less. DeLuca slammed a fist into the dirt. We need to move now. Every second we sit here, they get more comfortable. I say we flank them. With what? Delaney cut him off. 5 men with barely enough ammo for a sustained firefight against a fortified position? That's suicide, Corporal. Better than waiting to die in this hole? DeLuca's voice rose, drawing another burst from the machine gun. Keep it down, Delaney hissed. That's an order. He turned to the group. Check your ammo. Count every round. We need to be precise. As they complied, Delaney moved to where Doc worked on Farley. The wounded man's breathing had grown more labored, a wet, sucking sound accompanying each breath. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. His eyes were open, but unseeing. Doc, Delaney said softly. Carver didn't look up. His hands moved mechanically, applying pressure to wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. I just need to get the bleeding under control then. Doc. Delaney placed a hand on the medic's shoulder. He's not going to make it. Doc's movement slowed, then stopped. The front of his uniform was saturated with Farley's blood. I know. His voice was barely audible. How much morphine do you have? Doc's hands trembled as he reached for his bag. 2 syrettes left. The implication was clear. Morphine used on Farley wouldn't be available for the others if they were wounded. Delaney nodded. Do what you need to do. Doc stared at the syrette in his hand, then at Farley's pale face. The man had started making a high, keening sound with each exhale. He's got a wife, Doc said. Showed me her picture last week. They're expecting their first child in June. Delaney looked away. I'll write to her. Another letter. Another widow. Another child who would never know their father except through stories and photographs. Delaney had written 37 such letters since Normandy. Each one hollowed him out a little more. Doc uncapped the morphine syrette with practiced fingers. I'm sorry, Farley, he whispered. I'm so sorry. He inserted the needle into the dying man's thigh, depressing the plunger. Almost immediately, Farley's breathing eased, the tension leaving his body as the drug took effect. Grayson watched with wide eyes. He's going to die, isn't he? Yes, Doc answered flatly. Internal bleeding. Nothing I can do except make it painless. Grayson turned, away, his young face ashen. This isn't how it was supposed to be. What did you expect, kid? DeLuca snapped. Glory? Medals? This is war. Men die. Usually for nothing. That's enough, Corporal, Delaney warned. DeLuca wasn't finished. You know what they're saying, right? That the war's practically over. That the Germans are weeks from surrender. So what the hell are we doing here, getting cut to pieces for a goddamn crossroads nobody will remember? The word struck a nerve. Delaney had heard the same rumors. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was supposedly holed up in some bunker. Yet here they were, still dying in nameless forests, for objectives that would be forgotten as soon as they were taken. Our job, Delaney replied simply. The machine gun fell silent again. In the relative quiet, Grayson spoke softly, almost to himself. My mom makes these apple dumplings every fall. Uses apples from the tree behind our house. Cinnamon and brown sugar on top. He swallowed hard. Never thought I'd miss something as simple as that. Delaney studied the young private. The boy's hands had stopped shaking, replaced by a kind of numb resignation. Sometimes, when the fear became too much, the mind retreated to safer places. Beyond. Old man has a fishing cabin up in Vermont, Mercer added unexpectedly. Used to take me there every summer. Taught me to shoot on a little .22 when I was 8. First time I hit a can at 100 yards, he looked at me like... He trailed off. Never thought that would lead me here. Delaney understood. In the face of imminent death, men reached for fragments of who they had been before the war transformed them, before they had learned to kill and die with mechanical efficiency. Farley's breathing grew shallower, the intervals between each breath lengthening. Doc sat beside him, one hand on the dying man's wrist, monitoring his pulse. His face was etched with the toll of too many similar vigils. "Ammo count?" Delaney asked, pulling them back to the present. 23 rounds for the Springfield, Mercer reported. 3 full magazines and half of another for the Thompson, DeLuca said. About 100 rounds total. 30 for the Garand, Delaney added. Grayson, the private checked his rifle. 18. Doc, full magazine in the .45 plus 1 spare. 13 rounds total. Delaney did the mental calculation. Not enough. For a prolonged engagement. They'd need to make every shot count. The MG-42 barked again, the rounds impacting just above the crater's edge, showering them with dirt and fragments of rock. The Germans were finding their range. "We need a plan now, Sarge," DeLuca urged, "before they zero us completely." Delaney knew he was right. Staying in the crater meant certain death. Moving meant probable death. Neither option appealed, but command required choosing the least terrible path. "Mercer, can you get to that fallen oak?" Delaney pointed to a massive tree that had toppled about 40 yards to their right. "If you can get a clear shot from there, it's suicide," Doc interrupted, looking up from Farley's now still form. "They'll cut him down before he makes it halfway." "I'll cover him," DeLuca volunteered immediately. "Spray the tree line, keep their heads down long enough. And waste half our ammo in the process?" Delaney shook his head. "We need precision, not volume." "Then what's your brilliant plan?" DeLuca demanded, frustration boiling over. "Because I'm not going to die in this goddamn hole waiting for you to make up your mind." The tension crackled. Between them. Delaney recognized the fear beneath DeLuca's anger, the desperate need to act, to fight, rather than await execution. He'd seen it before in men pushed to their breaking point. "I can make it," Mercer said quietly. "If I time it between bursts, I might reach the oak." "Might isn't good enough," Delaney replied. "I need certainty." "There is no certainty here, Sarge," Mercer countered. "Just calculated risks." Delaney knew he was right. War was never about certainties, only probabilities and luck. And their luck was running perilously thin. A low, gurgling sound drew their attention. Farley had stopped breathing. His eyes stared sightlessly at the gray sky above. Doc gently closed them with 2 blood-stained fingers, his face impassive but his eyes hollow. "He's gone," Doc announced, voice devoid of emotion. He reached for Farley's dog tags, repeating the grim ritual. 1 for the record, 1 for the grave. The machine gun remained ominously silent. The Germans were waiting, confident in their position, knowing time was on their side. Grayson whispered a short prayer, crossing himself. Then he looked up at Delaney with unexpected resolve. "I'll draw their fire." "What?" Doc stared at him. "I'm the fastest runner," Grayson continued. "I can dash to that boulder cluster over there, get them to focus on me. Give Mercer a few seconds to reach the oak." DeLuca almost looked impressed. Kids got guts after all. Delaney studied Grayson. Something had changed in the young private's eyes. The naive idealism replaced by a harder, more pragmatic understanding. The transformation from boy to soldier happened at different times for each man. For Grayson, it was happening now, in this crater, with the bodies of his comrades, cooling beside him. "It's too risky," Delaney said finally. "We move together or not at all." "With respect, Sarge," Mercer interjected, "that guarantees none of us make it. The kid's offering us a chance." Delaney felt the weight of command pressing down on him like a physical burden. Every decision meant lives, lives he was responsible for, men who trusted him to make the right call. Send Grayson out as bait, and the boy would likely die. Refuse, and they might all die anyway. The impossible mathematics of leadership. Farley had gone cold beside them. Another name for Delaney's letters. Another face to join the parade of ghosts that marched through his dreams. 1 minute, Delaney said finally. We wait 1 more minute. The Germans think they have us. They might get careless. The seconds ticked by in excruciating slowness, each man lost in his own thoughts, preparing in his own way. DeLuca checked his Thompson for the 3rd time, mouth set in a grim line. Doc wiped Farley's blood from his hands with a bandage, movements mechanical. Grayson stared at his rifle as if seeing it for the first time. Mercer's eyes never left the tree line, calculating distances and angles with the precision that had made him the squad's best shot. Delaney felt oddly detached, as if observing himself from outside his body. How many times had he been here before? How many desperate situations, how many impossible choices? Yet somehow he had survived when others hadn't. Luck or skill or some combination of both had carried him through North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and countless nameless engagements in between. But luck was a finite resource, and Delaney couldn't shake the feeling that his was running out. 50 seconds. The silence stretched, broken only by their breathing and the distant rumble of artillery. Get ready, Delaney murmured. Mercer on my signal. You go for the oak. DeLuca, provide covering fire. Short, controlled bursts. Conserve your ammo. Grayson, Doc, you're with me. We move to that cluster of rocks to the left. Try to flank their position. Each man nodded, tension evident in the set of their shoulders, the tightness around their eyes. 40 seconds. Delaney mentally mapped their route, calculating angles and exposure times. 30 seconds. He thought briefly of Boston, of the construction job that would never wait for him, of the girl whose letters had stopped coming 6 months. 20 seconds. The MG-42 suddenly fell completely silent. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Something's changed, Mercer whispered. They're quieter. Delaney risked raising his head just high enough to peer over the crater's edge. The German position remained visible but still. No movement. No muzzle flash. Maybe they're repositioning, DeLuca suggested. Or waiting for us to make a mistake, Doc added grimly. 10 seconds. And then, through a gap in the trees, Mercer spotted it. A brief flash of movement. One of the German gunners had stood up, stretching his arms above his head. I've got a shot, Mercer breathed almost inaudibly. Delaney saw it too. A momentary lapse in discipline. The German believed they were safely pinned down, growing complacent in his security. Take it, Delaney ordered. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In one fluid motion, Mercer rose to a kneeling position. His rifle finding his shoulder as naturally as a bird takes to flight, he drew a slow breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the Springfield shattered the silence. The crack of Mercer's Springfield echoed through the forest, followed by a split second of absolute silence. Then came a distant cry of pain and German voices shouting in alarm. Got him, Mercer confirmed, his voice flat, but not clean. Before anyone could respond, the MG-42 erupted again. No longer the methodical, controlled bursts of before, but wild, panicked fire. The Germans were spraying the entire area, bullets cutting through foliage at random, their disciplined suppression replaced by fear. Now, Delaney shouted. Move! DeLuca was first out of the crater, Thompson at his shoulder, firing controlled, burst toward the German position as he darted from tree to tree. Mercer followed, moving with the fluid grace of a hunting cat, rifle already reloaded and ready. Grayson, Doc, with me, Delaney ordered, then launched himself over the craters. The forest had transformed into chaos. Bullets snapped through branches overhead, sending splinters raining down. Muzzle flashes strobed through the trees, illuminating the fog in brilliant, deadly pulses. The sound was deafening, the MG-42's distinctive ripping canvas roar punctuated by the sharp crack of rifles and DeLuca's Thompson. Delaney ran in a half-crouch, every sense heightened to an almost painful degree. 20 yards to the first viable cover. a cluster of boulders that might provide enough protection to assess their next move. He could hear Grayson and Doc behind him, their boots crushing pine needles and fallen leaves. Contact right. Mercer's Kentucky drawl cut through the cacophony. Delaney registered the warning just as rifle fire erupted from their flank. They'd stumbled into a second German position, smaller, probably just 2 or 3 riflemen providing security for the machine gun team. "Doc, down!" Delaney shouted, dropping to one knee and bringing his M1 to bear. He spotted movement, a field gray uniform partially concealed behind a fallen tree, and fired twice in rapid succession. The German jerked backward, rifle tumbling from his hands. Doc reached the boulders first, dragging his medical bag behind him. Delaney followed, pressing his back against the cold stone. His heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline flooding his system. "Where's Grayson?" Doc gasped. Delaney scanned the forest frantically. The private had been right behind them, but now... "There!" Doc pointed. Grayson had frozen halfway between the crater and their position, caught in the open as bullets tore through the air around him. The boy's face was a mask of terror, his body locked in place by fear so profound it overrode even basic survival instinct. "God damn it!" Delaney growled. "Cover me!" Before Doc could protest, Delaney lunged from behind the boulders, running straight for Grayson. German fire immediately redirected toward him, dirt kicking up at his feet. He ignored it, focusing solely on reaching the paralyzed private. "Move, soldier!" he roared as he approached. The command seemed to break through Grayson's terror. The young man's eyes refocused, his limbs unlocking. Delaney grabbed him by the shoulder, shoving him roughly toward the boulders. "Go! Go! Go!" They ran together, bullets hissing past them like angry hornets. 5 yards from safety, Grayson stumbled, letting out a sharp cry. Delaney caught him before he fell, half carrying him the remaining distance. They collapsed behind the boulders as the MG-42 stitched the ground where they had stood moments before. "You hit?" Delaney demanded, scanning Grayson for wounds. The private nodded, face pale with shock. "My leg?" Doc was already there, cutting away the blood-soaked fabric around Grayson's thigh. "Through and through," he reported after a quick examination. "Missed the artery. Lucky." Grayson let out a strangled laugh. "That's me. Lucky Grayson." On their left flank, DeLuca's Thompson chattered in short, vicious bursts. Mercer had reached the fallen oak, his rifle cracking at precise intervals as he picked targets with methodical efficiency. "Situation?" Delaney called to them. "2 Krauts, down on the right," DeLuca shouted back, ejecting an empty magazine and slamming in a fresh one. "But that fucking machine gun's still active." Mercer fired again before responding. "Wounded the gunner, but they've got a replacement on it now. Second man, maybe third. Can't get a clean shot from this angle." Delaney assessed their position. They'd gained ground, perhaps 50 yards closer to the German nest, but the advance had stalled. DeLuca and Mercer were pinned on the flanks, unable to move forward without support. Grayson was wounded, though still combat effective if necessary. And the Germans, despite their initial panic, were regrouping. Their window of opportunity was closing fast. "Talk to me, Doc," Delaney said, turning back to where the medic worked on Grayson's leg. "He'll live," Doc replied, tightening a field, dressing around the wound. "But he shouldn't run on this." Grayson gritted his teeth against the pain. "I can still fight, Sarge." Delaney nodded, then checked his rifle. 24 rounds remaining. Not enough for a sustained firefight, but maybe enough for one final push. The machine gun shifted focus, peppering DeLuca's position with a sustained burst that sent wood chips flying from the tree he sheltered behind. The corporal ducked lower, swearing violently. "They've got us zeroed again," he shouted. "We need to move or they'll walk it in." Delaney knew he was right. The Germans had recovered from the initial shock of Mercer's shot and were reasserting control over the battlefield. Soon they'd have the range dialed in on all their positions, and the Americans would be right back where they started, pinned, down with no escape. "We need to take out that gun," Delaney said, more to himself than the others. He studied the terrain ahead, calculating distances and angles. The German nest was maybe 100 yards away now, still partially concealed by The tree line. A frontal assault would be suicide, even with covering fire. But if they could flank it... "Mercer," he called. "Can you keep their heads down for 30 seconds?" The sharpshooter's reply was immediate. "Yes, sir." "DeLuca, how much ammo left?" "2. Full mags and change," the corporal reported. "Enough for one good rush." Delaney made his decision. "On my signal, both of you lay down everything you've got on that nest. Doc, stay with Grayson. Keep pressure on that wound." Doc looked up from his patient, eyes narrowing. "What are you planning, Sarge?" "I'm going to circle around to their left. Flank. If I can get close enough for a grenade toss..." "Suicide," Doc interrupted flatly. "They'll cut you down before you make it halfway." "Not if they're busy with them." Delaney nodded toward DeLuca and Mercer. "Let me go," DeLuca called from his position. "I'm faster." "And we need your Thompson's rate of fire for cover," Delaney countered. "It has to be me." A heavy silence fell over the squad, broken only by the intermittent fire from the German position. Each man understood what Delaney was proposing, a desperate gamble with odds heavily stacked against success. "I'll draw their fire," Grayson said suddenly. Delaney turned to the wounded private. "You can barely walk." "Don't need to walk to shoot," Grayson replied, checking his rifle with shaking hands. "I'll move to those rocks over there. Get their ore. Attention. Between me, Mercer, and DeLuca, we'll keep them busy enough for you to get close." Doc shook his head. "That wound opens up again, you could bleed out." "Better than all of us dying here," Grayson said with surprising conviction. The fear in his eyes hadn't disappeared, but something stronger had emerged alongside it. Determination, perhaps, or the simple will to survive. "I didn't come all this way to die in some German forest without a fight." Delaney studied the young private. The transformation he'd glimpsed earlier was complete. The boy who joined them 3 days ago was gone, replaced by a soldier who understood exactly what he was risking, and why. 30 seconds, Delaney said finally. "Keep your head down. Conserve your ammo. Short, controlled bursts, just enough to keep them looking your way." Grayson nodded, jaw set with fresh resolve. "Yes, sir." The plan took shape with grim efficiency. Delaney would circle, wide to the left, using the terrain for concealment while the others provided covering fire from 3 separate positions. If he could reach the German flank undetected, he might get close enough to toss a grenade into the nest. A desperate plan, but the only one with even a marginal chance of success. "On my signal," Delaney instructed. "DeLuca, you first. Full auto. Make them think you're making a push. Then Mercer, pick your shots. Grayson, you wait until they're focused on them, then open up from your new position." Each man acknowledged the order. Delaney checked his grenades. 3 fragmentation, 1 smoke. He tucked them securely in his jacket, ensuring they wouldn't rattle during his approach. "If this doesn't work," he began. "Save it for later, Sarge," DeLuca interrupted. "We're not dead yet." Delaney allowed himself a grim smile. 30 seconds of continuous fire, not a second more. Save enough ammo for your own defense. With that, he moved into position, crouched at the edge of their cover. The German nest lay ahead, partially visible through the trees. The MG-42 had fallen silent again, but Delaney could see movement. The gunners rotating positions, perhaps, or preparing for another attack. "Now!" he bellowed. DeLuca rose from cover, Thompson blazing. The submachine gun's distinctive report echoed through the forest as he emptied half a magazine in one continuous burst. The Germans responded immediately, the machine gun roaring to life, focusing on DeLuca's position. That was Mercer's cue. The sharpshooter began firing with methodical precision, each shot carefully placed to force the German gunners to keep their heads down. One round punched through a sandbag, another splintered the wooden support beside the machine gun. Delaney didn't wait to see more. The moment the Germans redirected their fire toward Mercer, he sprinted from cover, veering left into the denser part of the forest. His boots pounded against the earth as he ran in a low crouch, using every tree and bush for concealment. Behind him, he heard Grayson open fire, sporadic single shots from the wounded private's new position. Perfect. The Germans would be tracking, fire from 3 directions. their attention divided. Delaney moved through the forest like a ghost, decades of hunting experience guiding each step. 30 yards, 50. The sounds of battle grew more distant as he circled wider, avoiding sight lines, using the slope of the land to mask his approach. His lungs burned, muscles screaming with effort. Not as young as he used to be, not as fast, but still deadly, still determined. 70 yards from his starting position, Delaney paused, orienting himself. The German nest should be directly to his right now, perhaps 40 yards through the trees. He could hear the MG-42 still firing, its barrel probably glowing red-hot from sustained use. He moved forward again, more cautiously now, each step placed, with deliberate care, testing for fallen branches that might snap and give away his position. The forest floor was damp from recent rain, mercifully muffling his footfalls. 30 yards from the nest, Delaney caught his first clear glimpse of the German position. It was smaller than he'd expected. A simple hunting blind converted into a firing position, reinforced with sandbags and camouflage netting. The MG-42 dominated the center, its long barrel sweeping back and forth as it poured fire toward where DeLuca and Mercer were positioned. 2 German soldiers manned the gun, one firing, one feeding the belt. A third stood slightly back, rifle at the ready, scanning for threats. None of them were looking in Delaney's direction. 20 yards. Delaney removed a grenade from his jacket, holding it ready. His heart pounded in his chest, but his hands were steady, fear burned away by the cold clarity of purpose. 15 yards. The German rifleman shifted position, turning slightly toward Delaney's approach. For one heart-stopping moment, Delaney thought he'd been spotted, but the soldier's gaze passed over him, returning to the forest where the Americans were firing. 10 yards. Close enough. Delaney pulled the pin on the grenade, counted to 2, and prepared to throw. A twig snapped beneath his boot. The German rifleman spun, his reaction preternaturally fast. Their eyes met across the clearing, a moment of mutual recognition and surprise. Then the German's rifle was coming up, his mouth opening to shout a warning. Delaney threw the grenade, in one fluid motion, not at the nest as planned, but directly at the rifleman. The German's warning died in his throat as he instinctively tried to dodge the incoming explosive. He partially succeeded, but the grenade detonated close enough to throw him backward, riddled with shrapnel. The machine gunners reacted instantly, the gun swinging toward Delaney's position. He was already moving, diving behind a thick tree trunk as bullets chewed the ground where he had stood, 5 yards from the nest. So close, yet impossibly far, with the MG-42 now focused directly on him. "Scheisse! Amerikaner!" one of the Germans shouted. Delaney pressed himself against the tree, bullets splintering bark inches from his head. He couldn't move forward or back without exposing himself to fire. The machine gun had him pinned, and it was only a matter of time before the Germans flanked his position or called in reinforcements. Then, from the forest behind him, came a sound that made his heart soar. DeLuca's Thompson, much closer than before. The corporal had recognized Delaney's predicament and was advancing, drawing fire away from Delaney's position. The MG-42's attention wavered, its fire redirecting toward this new threat. Delaney seized the moment, reaching for another grenade. Pin out, 2-count, throw. This time his aim was perfect. The grenade arced through the air and landed directly in the machine gun nest. The German gunners saw it, their expressions shifting from determination to terror in an instant. One dived away, the other reached for the grenade. The explosion ripped through the nest, sending sandbags and body parts flying in a terrible cloud of smoke and debris. The MG-42 fell silent, its barrel drooping pathetically as the firing mechanism was torn apart. But Delaney had no time to celebrate. A sharp crack from his right, a rifle shot. Pain bloomed in his shoulder, hot and immediate. He stumbled, nearly falling, as another German soldier emerged from the trees, working the bolt on his Mauser for a second shot. DeLuca's Thompson stuttered, then fell silent, empty. Delaney raised his own rifle one-handed, knowing he wouldn't be fast enough. The crack of Mercer's Springfield cut through the chaos. The German's head snapped back, a red mist erupting from the exit wound as he crumpled to the ground. One perfect shot from over 100 yards away. "Sarge!" DeLuca was shouting, running toward him. "Sarge, you hit?" Delaney pressed a hand to, his shoulder feeling the warm wetness of blood. "I'm good," he lied. "Secure the position." DeLuca reached him, eyes widening at the sight of the blood soaking through Delaney's uniform. "Doc!" he bellowed. "Medic!" The forest fell silent except for the distant rumble of artillery and the ringing in Delaney's ears. The machine gun nest was destroyed, its occupants dead or dying. But at what cost? "Grayson," Delaney managed. "How's Grayson?" DeLuca's expression tightened. "Don't know. He was laying down cover fire, then I heard him yell. Doc went to him." Delaney pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the fire in his shoulder. "We need to stay put," DeLuca ordered, surprising both of them with his tone. "You're bleeding out. Let Doc look at you first." Before Delaney could argue, movement caught his eye. Doc emerging from the trees, supporting a limping Grayson. The private's face was pale from blood loss, but he was alive, conscious, moving under his own power. Relief washed over Delaney, momentarily stronger than the pain. "The kid made it," he murmured. "We all did," DeLuca replied, a note of wonder in his voice. "Somehow." Doc reached them, lowering Grayson gently to the ground before turning his attention to Delaney's wound. "Let me see," he said, professional mask firmly in place despite the exhaustion etched into his features. As Doc worked, Mercer appeared, rifle still at the ready, as he scanned the surrounding forest. "All clear," he reported. "No sign of additional enemy forces." Delaney nodded, wincing as Doc probed the wound. "The crossroads?" "Visible from here," Mercer confirmed. "Maybe 200 yards north. Looks quiet." Their objective. The reason 12 men had marched into these woods. The reason 7 of them would never leave. "We hold this position," Delaney decided. "Secure the nest, set up a defensive perimeter. DeLuca, check the German bodies for ammo, anything useful. Mercer, find a vantage point. Keep your eyes peeled for movement." The men moved to comply, falling, back on training and routine in the aftermath of chaos. Doc finished bandaging Delaney's shoulder, his touch gentle despite his brisk efficiency. "It's not too deep," he reported. "Bullet went through clean. You're lucky." Delaney almost laughed. Lucky. Such a relative term in war. Grayson sat nearby, his injured leg stretched out before him, fresh bandages stark white against the grime of battle. The boy caught Delaney's eye, a question in his gaze. "You did good, Private," Delaney told him. "Real good." A slight smile touched Grayson's lips. "Guess the name fits after all, huh, Sarge?" Delaney nodded, allowing himself a moment of pride in the young soldier's growth. From terrified replacement to battle-tested survivor in the span of a single brutal engagement. But their position remained precarious. The machine gun was neutralized, but they were still deep in enemy territory, short on ammunition, with 2 wounded men. The mission wasn't complete until they secured the crossroads. "Rest 5 minutes," Delaney ordered. "Then we move north, finish this job." DeLuca returned from checking the German bodies, his expression grim. "Sarge, you need to see this." Delaney followed him to where one of the dead Germans lay, noting the insignia on the man's uniform. Not Wehrmacht regulars as expected, but Waffen-SS. Hitler's fanatical elite troops known for fighting to the death rather than surrendering. "If there are SS in these woods..." DeLuca didn't need to finish the thought. Delaney nodded, understanding the implications. Their small victory might have stirred a hornet's nest. If an SS unit was operating in the area, reinforcements would already be on the way. He looked toward the distant crossroads, their objective still tantalizingly out of reach. Then back at his battered squad, Grayson barely able to walk, his own shoulder throbbing with each heartbeat, all of them exhausted and running on nothing but adrenaline and determination. One last push. One final gamble. "Load up," Delaney ordered. "We're moving out in 3 minutes." The men exchanged glances, reading the resolution in their sergeant's eyes. No one argued. No one questioned. They simply prepared, checking weapons, tightening, bandages, steeling themselves for whatever came next. The forest waited, silent and indifferent to their struggle. The distant crossroads beckoned, and somewhere in the trees ahead, unseen enemies prepared to meet them. Delaney checked his rifle one last time, grim determination settling over him like armor. It was time to finish this. It's time to finish this, Delaney had said, and now as they moved through the trees toward the crossroads, those words hung in the air like a promise or a death sentence. The forest had grown thinner, affording glimpses of their objective ahead. The crossroads was little more than a cleared intersection where two dirt tracks met, but its strategic importance was obvious even to the exhausted men. From this elevation, they could see for miles in every direction. Perfect for artillery, spotting. Perfect for controlling the movement of men and machines through the densely wooded terrain. Perfect for an ambush. Hold, Delaney whispered, raising his fist. The squad froze, each man instinctively finding cover. Mercer melted against a tree trunk, rifle ready. DeLuca crouched behind a fallen log, Thompson cradled in his arms. Doc supported Grayson, whose face had grown alarmingly pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. See it? Delaney asked Mercer. The sharpshooter nodded slightly. Foxhole, north side of the crossing. Maybe two men. Delaney saw it now too. The subtle disruption in the earth, the almost imperceptible glint of a helmet barely visible above ground level. The Germans had prepared defensive positions around the crossroads, just as they'd expected. Any sign of another MG? Delaney asked. Mercer scanned the area, his eyes narrowed in concentration. Nothing obvious, but they'd be idiots not to have one. DeLuca shifted restlessly. How do you want to play this, Sarge? Delaney assessed their situation with brutal honesty. His shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, the bandage already soaked through with blood. Grayson could barely stand. Much less fight effectively. They were down to their last magazines, operating on borrowed time before SS reinforcements arrived. A frontal assault would be suicide, but they had no choice. Orders were orders, and the crossroads needed to be secured. Direct approach, Delaney decided. We can't afford to waste time with elaborate flanking maneuvers. They'll see us coming, Doc warned. Counting on it, Delaney replied. Mercer, find yourself a good position, preferably with elevation. When the shooting starts, I want you picking off anyone who shows their head. The sharpshooter nodded, already scanning the terrain for an ideal firing location. DeLuca, you're with me. We move up the center, straight for that foxhole. The corporal grinned, a fierce, wolfish expression that transformed his face. About damn time. Doc, you stay with Grayson. Find cover, keep your heads down. Doc looked like he wanted to protest, but one glance at Grayson's condition silenced any objection. The young private was deteriorating rapidly, blood loss and shock taking their toll despite Doc's best efforts. What about support? Doc asked instead. Weren't we supposed to have artillery on call once we reached the objective? Delaney tapped, the shattered remains of their radio still strapped to the back of their fallen radio man somewhere back in the forest. No way to call it in. We're on our own. A heavy silence followed his words. Each man understood what this meant. No reinforcements, no artillery, no evacuation for the wounded. Just 5 battered soldiers against an unknown number of enemies, fighting for a patch of dirt that would be forgotten as soon as the next objective appeared on some colonel's map. We've come this far, DeLuca said finally. Might as well finish the job. Delaney nodded, grateful for the corporal's simple courage. Ammo check one last time. The count was grim. Delaney had 17 rounds for his M1. DeLuca had less than 1 full magazine for his Thompson. Mercer reported having 12 rounds for his Springfield, plus an additional 8 rounds he'd scavenged from Jenkins's ammunition pouches. Doc had his pistol with 7 rounds. Grayson had 9 rounds left, though in his condition firing accurately would be a challenge. 1 fragmentation grenade remained among them, which Delaney kept. Barely enough for a single firefight, let alone taking and holding a position. Make Every shot count, Delaney instructed. Mercer, you move first, find your position, get comfortable. Wait for my signal before you fire. The sharpshooter nodded, then melted into the forest with the same fluid grace that had kept him alive through 3 years of war. Delaney watched him go, reminded again why Mercer was the most valuable man in the squad. Not just for his shooting, but for his patience, his discipline, his quiet competence. Doc, get Grayson to that cluster of rocks, Delaney continued, pointing to a defensible position about 30 yards to their right. Keep him stable. If things go sideways, your priority is getting him out alive, understand? Doc's expression hardened. We all go home, Sarge. Together. That's an order, Private Carver, Delaney said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Grayson is your responsibility. After a moment, Doc nodded reluctantly. Yes, sir. As Doc helped Grayson limp toward the designated position, Delaney turned to DeLuca. The corporal was checking his Thompson one last time, his movements precise, despite the tremor of exhaustion in his hands. You and me, Corporal, Delaney said quietly. Straight up the middle, DeLuca's eyes met his. Just like Sicily, Delaney allowed himself a grim smile. Let's hope it ends better this time. In Sicily, they'd lost half their platoon taking a similar crossroads. The memory of that day still haunted Delaney's dreams. The screams of dying men, the smell of burning flesh. The flies that came afterward. Thick, black clouds of them descending on the bodies they couldn't retrieve for 3 days. On my signal, Delaney said, pushing the memory away. Conserve your ammo. Short, controlled bursts. We move from cover to cover, working our way to that foxhole. DeLuca nodded, all trace of his usual recklessness gone, replaced by cold professionalism. For all his hot-headed tendencies, the corporal was a veteran, a survivor of the same brutal campaigns that had forged Delaney. They waited, tension mounting as seconds stretched into minutes. Somewhere in the forest, Mercer was finding his position, settling in, preparing for the single perfect shot that might make the difference between victory and annihilation. Doc would be tending to Grayson, whispering reassurances that both men knew might be lies. Now, Delaney said finally. He and DeLuca moved as one, emerging from cover in a half-crouch, weapons at the ready. They advanced deliberately, using every available tree and bush for concealment, their practiced eyes constantly scanning for threats. 50 yards from the crossroads, the first shot rang out, not from Mercer's position but from the German foxhole. The round went wide, kicking up dirt to Delaney's left. Then a second shot, closer. They've spotted us, DeLuca hissed. Keep moving, Delaney ordered. They picked up the pace, still advancing in controlled bursts, 5 yards at a time from cover to cover. The German fire intensified, rifle rounds snapping through the branches around them. Delaney caught a glimpse of movement in the foxhole. 2 helmets visible now, 2 rifles probing for targets. Mercer, any time now, Delaney muttered, knowing. The sharpshooter couldn't hear him. As if in response, a single crack echoed from somewhere to their right. One of the helmets in the foxhole disappeared abruptly. The second German ducked down, momentarily panicked by his comrade's sudden death. Now, Delaney shouted. He and DeLuca broke cover simultaneously, charging toward the foxhole. The remaining German rose up, rifle swinging wildly between the 2 advancing Americans. He chose DeLuca, squeezing off a round that tore through the corporal's sleeve but missed flesh. DeLuca didn't break stride. His Thompson stuttered, a short 3-round burst that caught the German in the chest, driving him backward into the foxhole. Push, Delaney ordered, his own rifle at his shoulder as he scanned for additional threats. They were 20 yards from the crossroads when the world exploded. The hidden machine gun that Mercer had feared revealed itself, opening fire from a concealed position on their left flank. Not an MG-42 this time, but an MG-34, slightly slower rate of fire but no less deadly. Dirt kicked up in a line that tracked toward DeLuca with terrifying precision. Down! Delaney shouted, diving forward as rounds tore through the space he'd occupied a heartbeat earlier. DeLuca wasn't as fortunate. The burst caught him mid-stride, punching through his left side. He stumbled, nearly fell, but somehow remained upright, blood already soaking his uniform. I'm hit, he called, voice tight with pain but still controlled. Left side, don't think it's too bad. Delaney knew better. He'd seen enough wounds to recognize when a man was lying to himself. Get to cover, he ordered. Now! DeLuca staggered toward a shell crater 10 yards away, clutching his side. The machine gun tracked him, rounds kicking up dirt at his heels. From somewhere behind them, Mercer's Springfield cracked again, searching for the MG's position. Delaney used the distraction to advance, pushing forward in a low crouch. The crossroads was close now, just 15 yards away. He could see the foxhole clearly, its 2 occupants slumped in death. But the machine gun continued to fire, keeping DeLuca pinned down, preventing any further advance. A single grenade might turn the tide. If he could locate the gun's position, if he could get close enough to throw accurately. The decision was made for him when Grayson suddenly appeared on his right, limping badly, but moving with desperate determination. The private had broken away from Doc, defying orders to remain in cover. Grayson, get back, Delaney shouted. The young private ignored him, continuing his painful advance directly toward the machine gun's position. His rifle was up, firing methodically, despite his unsteady gait. 1 round, 2, 3, forcing the German gunner to duck momentarily. It was the opening DeLuca needed. The corporal rose from the crater, Thompson blazing as he charged forward. Blood soaked his entire left side, but his face was a mask of cold fury as he crossed the final distance to the crossroads. The machine gun swung back toward him, too late. DeLuca reached the foxhole, diving into it for cover, his submachine gun still spitting fire toward the concealed MG position. Delaney seized the moment, sprinting forward to join DeLuca. Bullets snapped past him, close enough to feel their passage disturbing the air. 5 yards. 3. Then he was sliding into the foxhole beside the corporal, dirt and pine needles cascading over them as the machine gun pounded their position. How bad? Delaney demanded, eyeing the growing bloodstain on DeLuca's uniform. Bad enough, the corporal admitted through gritted teeth. But I can still fight. Delaney did a quick survey of their situation. They'd reached the crossroads, technically achieving their objective, but they were pinned down by the machine gun, unable to move or properly secure the position. Mercer was still somewhere in the forest, providing what cover he could. Doc was presumably with Grayson, though the private's reckless advance had thrown that into question. The machine gun continued its relentless fire, keeping them pressed against the bottom of the foxhole. Occasionally, Mercer's rifle would crack, forcing the gunner to momentarily seek cover, but the respite never lasted long enough to allow movement. We need to take out that gun, Delaney said, checking his last grenade. DeLuca nodded, face gray, with pain and blood loss. I'll cover you. Save your ammo, Delaney countered. I'll wait for Mercer's next shot, then make a run for it. Before they could implement this plan, the sound of German voices carried to them. More soldiers approaching from the north side of the crossroads. Reinforcements, just as they'd feared. Scheisse. Was ist passiert? A voice called. Amerikaner, came the reply from the machine gun position. Vorsicht. Delaney and DeLuca exchanged grim looks. Their situation, already desperate, had just become dire. More Germans meant they'd soon be surrounded, outgunned with no hope of escape. What's the play, Sarge? DeLuca asked quietly. Before Delaney could answer, a new sound cut through the chaos. The distinctive thunderous report of an American M1 rifle, firing rapidly from somewhere to their right. Grayson. The private had positioned himself on a slight rise, using his elevated position to fire down on the approaching German reinforcements. His wounded leg was stretched awkwardly before him, but his hands were steady as he emptied his rifle into the enemy's ranks. The Germans scrambled for cover, momentarily disorganized by this unexpected threat from their flank. It was the diversion they needed. Now, Delaney ordered, I'll take the machine gun. You deal with those reinforcements. He didn't wait for acknowledgement, already in motion. Launching himself from the foxhole, Delaney sprinted toward the source of the machine gun. Fire! His shoulder burned, his lungs ached, but adrenaline carried him forward with reckless speed. 20 yards. The machine gun swung toward him, alerted by his movement. 15 yards. He could see it now, a hasty nest constructed from fallen logs, and earth, the MG-34's barrel protruding from the narrow firing slit. 10 yards. Mercer's rifle cracked again, forcing the gunner to duck. Delaney pulled the pin on his grenade, counted 2, and threw with all his remaining strength. The grenade arced through the air, disappearing into the gun nest. A moment of silence, then a muffled cry of alarm. Delaney dove for cover as the explosion tore through the position, sending splinters and earth skyward in a deadly fountain. When he looked up, the machine gun had fallen silent. Rising to a crouch, Delaney approached cautiously, rifle ready. The nest was destroyed, its occupants torn apart by the grenade's blast. 2 men, maybe 3, it was difficult to tell in the carnage. "Sarge, we've got trouble." DeLuca's voice came from the foxhole, urgent despite its weakness. Delaney turned, scanning the battlefield. DeLuca was still in the foxhole, firing short, bursts at the German reinforcements who had taken cover among the trees north of the crossroads. Mercer continued to provide support from his hidden position, each shot claiming a target with methodical efficiency. And Grayson was slumped over his rifle, motionless. "Doc!" Delaney bellowed. "Grayson's hit." He saw movement as Doc broke cover, rushing toward the fallen private with reckless disregard for his own safety. German bullets kicked up dirt around the medic, but somehow he reached Grayson unscathed, immediately dragging him into the shelter of a shallow depression. Delaney wanted to join them, to know if the kid was still alive, but the Germans were pressing their attack, using the trees for cover as they worked their way closer to the crossroads. If they retook the position, everything would be for nothing. "DeLuca, hold the foxhole," he ordered, already moving to a flanking position, intending to catch the Germans in a crossfire. He found cover behind a fallen tree, its trunk thick enough to stop rifle rounds. From there, he had a clear line of sight to the German advance. 8 men, moving in disciplined pairs, working their way from tree to tree. Not the fanatical charge he'd expected from SS troops, but a methodical, professional assault. Delaney lined up his sights on the lead soldier, exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The M1 bucked against his wounded shoulder, sending fire down his arm, but the shot was true. The German fell, and Delaney was already shifting his aim to the next target. Between Delaney's fire from the flank, DeLuca's Thompson from the foxhole, and Mercer's precise shooting from the forest, the German advance stalled. 3 of their number were down, the rest pinned behind inadequate cover. For a moment, Delaney allowed himself to hope. They'd destroyed the machine gun, reached the crossroads, and were holding their ground against superior numbers. Perhaps they might survive this after all. Then he spotted him, a lone German soldier who had circled wide, using the chaos of the main attack as cover. The man was young, barely more than a boy, with a smooth face that seemed incongruous beneath his steel helmet. He moved cautiously through the trees, rifle in hand, apparently unaware that Mercer had him in his sights. Delaney waited for the shot, for the telltale crack of Mercer's Springfield that would end the threat. Seconds passed. The young German continued his advance, now dangerously close to Doc's position, where he worked frantically over Grayson's still form. Why wasn't Mercer firing? The answer came in a flash of understanding. The sharpshooter had hesitated. Perhaps something in the German's youthful face had given him pause, reminded him of younger brothers or cousins back in Kentucky. Whatever the reason, Mercer's moment of humanity had become a deadly liability. The young German spotted Doc and Grayson. His rifle came up, finger moving to the trigger. Delaney swung his M1 around, knowing he was too far to make a clean shot. "Doc, 3 o'clock." Doc looked up, seeing the threat too late. The German's rifle was already aimed, his stance solid, about to fire. DeLuca's Thompson roared, the sound deafening in the sudden lull. The burst caught the young German across the chest, throwing him backward against a tree trunk. His rifle discharged harmlessly into the air as he slid to the ground, leaving a crimson streak on the bark. Delaney turned toward the foxhole in time to see DeLuca collapse, the Thompson slipping from fingers too weak to hold it any longer. The corporal had used the last of his strength for that final saving burst of fire. "Man down!" Delaney shouted, already moving toward the foxhole. "Doc, I need you." But Doc didn't respond, still bent over Grayson's motionless form, his hands covered in blood, shoulders shaking with what might have been exertion or silent sobs. The remaining Germans had begun to retreat, falling back into the forest under the continued pressure of Mercer's shooting. Delaney reached the foxhole, sliding down beside DeLuca. The corporal's eyes were open but unfocused, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Hang on," Delaney urged, applying pressure to the wound in DeLuca's side. "Just hang on. We've got the crossroads. Reinforcements will be here soon." DeLuca's lips moved, forming words too quiet for Delaney to hear. He leaned closer. Did we get them all?" DeLuca whispered. "Yeah, Tony. We got them all." "You did good." A slight smile touched DeLuca's pale lips. "Just like Sicily. Told you. This time would be better." Delaney felt a cold weight settle in his chest as DeLuca's eyes drifted closed, his breathing becoming more labored. "Doc," he called again, more desperately. "I need you here." This time Doc looked up. His face was a mask of exhaustion and defeat. He shook his head once, a small, final gesture. Grayson was gone. Delaney turned back to DeLuca, but the corporal had slipped into unconsciousness, blood still seeping between Delaney's fingers despite his best efforts to staunch the flow. Another man he couldn't save, another letter he would have to write. "Sarge." Mercer's voice came from behind him. The sharpshooter had finally left his position, rifle cradled in his arms as he surveyed the aftermath of the battle. "Germans are pulling back. Looks like they're regrouping, probably waiting for reinforcements." Delaney nodded mechanically. "Secure the perimeter. Use their weapons if you need to. Doc will help me with DeLuca." Mercer hesitated, his gaze falling on the young German soldier. His hesitation had nearly cost them everything. "Sarge, Not now," Delaney cut him off. "Secure the perimeter, that's an order." The sharpshooter moved off silently, shouldering his rifle as he went to check each of the fallen Germans, ensuring none posed a further threat. Delaney turned his attention back to DeLuca, pressing harder on the wound, willing the bleeding to stop through sheer determination. Doc appeared beside him, medical bag in hand, movements automatic as he assessed DeLuca's condition. His face gave nothing away, but Delaney could read the diagnosis in the tightness around his eyes, the grim set of his mouth. "How bad?" Delaney asked anyway. "Bad," Doc replied simply. "Multiple penetrating wounds to the abdomen and lower chest. He's bleeding internally. Without surgery." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Delaney glanced toward where Grayson lay. "And the kid?" Doc's hands stilled momentarily. "Single shot to the neck. Severed his carotid artery. He bled. Out in seconds, nothing I could do." They worked in silence after that, Doc cleaning and bandaging DeLuca's wounds with mechanical efficiency, while Delaney kept pressure on the worst of them. Both men knew they were only delaying the inevitable. Without proper medical attention, DeLuca would die, just as Grayson had died, just as Jenkins and Farley and the others had died. The only question was how long it would take. "Sarge." Mercer's call drew Delaney's attention. The sharpshooter stood at the edge of the crossroads, peering into the forest. Movement to the south, multiple contacts. More Germans. Delaney felt a cold resignation settle over him. They'd taken the crossroads, but they couldn't hold it. Not with DeLuca dying, Doc exhausted, and only himself and Mercer still combat effective. Their ammunition was nearly depleted, their position exposed. "Prepare to fall back," he ordered, already calculating their best escape route. "We'll use the trees for cover, head west back toward our lines." "Wait," Mercer called, something new in his voice. "I don't think they're Germans. The uniforms are wrong." Delaney joined him, straining to see through the trees. Figures moved in the distance, advancing cautiously. Then he saw it, the distinctive silhouette of American helmets, the olive drab of U.S. Army fatigues. "Hold your fire," he shouted. "Friendlies. Approaching." The lead American spotted them, rifle raising momentarily before recognition set in. "Flash," the soldier called out, the first half of the day's recognition code. "Thunder." Delaney responded automatically. The Americans advanced more confidently now, a full platoon spreading out as they secured the area. Their lieutenant, young, with captain's bars on his helmet that marked him as a forward observer, approached. Delaney, Sergeant Delaney, 3rd Battalion, 117th Infantry. Delaney nodded, suddenly aware of how he must look. Uniform soaked with blood, both his and others, face streaked with dirt and gunpowder residue, eyes hollowed by exhaustion and loss. Lieutenant Parker, 2nd Battalion. We're your relief. The officer surveyed the battlefield, taking in the German bodies, the destroyed machine gun nests, the blood-soaked ground. Looks like you had a hell of a fight. We took the crossroads, Delaney said simply. It seemed important to establish that fact, to ensure that the cost had meaning. The lieutenant nodded. So I see. Good work, Sergeant. His gaze fell on DeLuca's, still form in the foxhole on Grayson's body where Doc had covered it with a field jacket. What's your situation? 2 KIA, 1 critical, 2 walking wounded. Delaney's voice sounded distant to his own ears. We need a medic for Corporal DeLuca. Abdominal wounds, internal bleeding. The lieutenant turned, calling for his medic. Men moved with practiced efficiency, securing the perimeter, setting up defensive positions, preparing for potential counterattacks. Normal, routine actions that seemed surreal after the desperate struggle Delaney and his squad had endured. Your orders were to secure the crossroads until relieved, the lieutenant continued. Mission accomplished, Sergeant. We'll take it from here. Mission accomplished. Such simple words to describe the slaughter that had brought them to this point. 12 men had entered the forest. 3 remained, and one of those was dying in a foxhole, his lifeblood seeping into foreign soil. The lieutenant's medic knelt beside DeLuca, face grim as he checked the corporal's wounds. After a moment, he looked up at Delaney and shook his head slightly. Too late. Too much damage. Nothing to be done. Delaney nodded once, acknowledging the unspoken assessment. Another name for his letters, another face for his nightmares. Sergeant, you and your men should fall back to the aid station, the lieutenant was saying. Get those, Wounds looked at. There's a jeep about half a click south that can take you. Delaney shook his head. Not until I know my men are taken care of. He looked meaningfully at DeLuca and Grayson. The lieutenant understood. Of course, we'll make arrangements. As the relief force established their positions, Delaney found himself standing at the center of the crossroads, surveying the battlefield. German bodies lay scattered among the trees, testimony to the desperate fight. Shell casings glinted in the dirt, brass catching the afternoon sun. Blood darkened the earth, already drying to a dull rust color. Doc sat beside Grayson's body, head bowed, hands still stained crimson despite his efforts to clean them. Mercer stood a short distance away, rifle cradled in his arms, eyes fixed on the young German soldier he had hesitated to kill. And DeLuca lay in the foxhole, chest still rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths as he fought a battle he could not win. Delaney felt nothing. Not victory, not relief, not even grief. Just a hollow emptiness, a void where emotion should be. They had taken the crossroads. They had completed their mission. And for what? Another patch of blood-soaked earth that would be forgotten as soon as the next objective appeared on some colonel's map. The distant thunder of artillery rolled across the forest, a reminder that the war continued unabated. Somewhere other men were fighting and dying, just as his had fought and died here. The great machinery of war grinding on, consuming lives with mechanical indifference. Mercer appeared at his side, face etched with a guilt that Delaney recognized all too well. I hesitated, the sharpshooter said quietly. That German kid, I had him in my sights, but I just couldn't pull the trigger. It happens, Delaney replied, unable to summon the energy for absolution or condemnation. War makes killers of us all one way or another. Sometimes the body refuses. DeLuca didn't hesitate. No, Delaney agreed. He didn't. They stood in silence watching as the relief force transformed the crossroads into a defensive position, digging new foxholes, setting up machine guns of their own. The cycle continuing, the war machine rolling forward. "What happens now, Sarge?" Mercer asked finally. Delaney gazed toward the horizon, where the sound of distant fighting rumbled like an approaching storm. "We go back, get patched up, get new orders. Keep moving forward until the war ends or we end, that's all there is." His words hung in the air between them, stark in their simplicity, brutal in their truth. That was what it came down to in the end. The endless push forward, the grinding advance measured in yards gained and lives lost, until the final objective was reached, or there was no one left to reach it. From the foxhole, a medic called out, "He's gone." DeLuca had finally lost. His fight slipping away quietly while they stood talking, Delaney closed his eyes briefly, adding another name to the litany of the dead, another letter to be written, another ghost to join the parade. "Sarge?" Doc's voice, hollow with exhaustion. "Grayson's personal effects. For his family." The medic held out the young private's blood-stained wallet, dog tags, and a crumpled photograph. A smiling girl in a summer dress, standing beneath an apple tree. Delaney took them mechanically, tucking them into his pocket alongside DeLuca's effects. 2 more families to notify. 2 more doors that would open to reveal a solemn-faced officer bearing the worst news imaginable. "I'll take care of it," he promised, though the words felt inadequate, almost obscene in their insufficiency. Lieutenant Parker approached, his expression carefully neutral. "Sergeant, the jeep is ready. We've loaded your casualties. Time to move out." Delaney nodded, suddenly bone-weary, the adrenaline that had sustained him draining away to leave only exhaustion and pain. His shoulder throbbed, a dull, persistent reminder of his own mortality. As they prepared to leave, Delaney took one last look at the crossroads they had fought so desperately to secure. Already it was transforming under the efficient hands of the relief force, the evidence of their struggle being erased, replaced by new defenses, new men, new weapons. In a week, no one would remember what had happened here. In a month, even, the names of the dead would begin to fade, but Delaney would remember. He would carry them with him. Grayson with his apple dumplings and fading optimism, DeLuca with his fierce courage and quick temper, Jenkins, Farley, and all the others who had marched into the forest and would never march out again. The jeep's engine rumbled to life. Doc and Mercer climbed aboard, faces etched with the same hollow exhaustion that Delaney felt. He joined them, settling beside the flag-draped forms of DeLuca and Grayson. As they pulled away, Delaney heard the distant chatter of machine gun fire, the war continuing its relentless march. Another day, another hill, another crossroads. The names and faces would change, but the cost would remain the same. He closed his eyes, letting the jeep's motion rock him into a state of numb detachment. They had won their battle, secured their objective. Victory, they would call it in the reports. Success. But as the crossroads disappeared behind them and the forest closed in once more, Sergeant Frank Delaney knew the truth. In war, there are no victories, only varying degrees of loss. Only the cold calculation of how many lives must be sacrificed to move the front line forward another 100 yards. Only the endless cycle of death and destruction that had consumed his squad and would continue to consume others until the guns finally fell silent. They had taken the crossroads, but the cost had been too high. It was always too high, and somewhere in the distance the war raged on. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.